Hello. So this time I've read Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price. It's a history book, like a general introduction to the Vikings. And I fear this video might not be interesting for anyone but me because it's so like the reason that I read this book is so tied up with just like stuff that's happening in my life that I'm mostly just going to be talking about that, honestly. So the reason that I'm reading this book is that some friends and me have some friends and I, geez, am I an English teacher or not? Um, some friends and I have decided to play a role playing game called Sagas of the Icelanders, and Sagas of the Icelanders is, um, in my opinion, one of the most interesting role playing games, just period, like ever made. Um, because what it aims to do is emulate the sort of texture and like type of stories that are told in the Icelandic sagas. And the Icelandic sagas are sort of an interesting mix between mythology and history because on the one hand they are somewhat useful as historical sources, like many of them refer to actual historical people and roughly the things that they did, but on the other hand they're also filled with mythological themes and things that probably didn't happen, like gods intervening in people's lives and um, people having basically superpowers and stuff like that. So the game is like similarly stands bestride like mythology and history, which is why I don't know. I feel like there's just so much to say about that decision. Like it's a game in which you both like maybe could like encounter Loki and have some sort of conflict with him. And also at the same time it's a game in which you could feasibly like get food poisoning and die. Um like it very much is interested in this sort of mixture of mythology and history. And I think that that sort of goes to I mean, maybe this is a little bit trivial, but like the Viking mindset did not view mythology and history as being like distinct categories, and so neither does this game. Um, anyway, it's a really interesting game, and I'm the like game master, I'm the person running it. So I've just sort of taken an interest in Viking culture, Viking history. Probably later I'll be getting into Viking mythology. I feel like I'm going through a phase now in my like mid 20s that I was supposed to go through when I was like 13, where I'm like, oh man, tell me more about, the weapons that the Norse gods used. But what's interesting, I guess, is that as a didactic 25-year-old, um, my interest is like I guess more like multifaceted than that. I know too much about anthropology to be sort of enamored of the idea that we have like a clear understanding of who the Viking people were. Sorry, I just realized my window was very bright. Oh, that didn't help. Um, you'll just have to deal with the sun coming in through that window. Um, Sorry, totally distracted. Oh, I've read too much anthropology and I'm too interested in anthropology. I guess I just like know too much about how this knowledge is produced to think that we have a clear idea of who these people were, or even that we like could in the future have a clear idea of who these people were. Um, and fortunately, Neil Price is sort of on board with my approach, my thinking about these things because he says very clearly that there's a lot of things that we just don't know about the Viking people, like shockingly basic things. Um, we don't know where women went when they died. Um, first of all, we actually don't know where normal, like low, like uppercase V Viking people thought they went when they died because it's despite popular culture, like the Vikings didn't all die in battle. That's not like a feasible thing that a society can achieve. Many of them just died in the normal ways. And so where did those people think that they were what was going to happen to them after they died? Did they think they were just going to be, annihilated? Um, it's unclear. Um, it's also, I mean, in my the relatively like limited discussions that this book has about Viking mythology, um, it raises sort of an interesting theme of this the like Viking worldview around nothingness and annihilation, because I think it's sort of tempting when we're reading back ancient mythologies to inject this sort of Christian rejection of of the void, of absolute nothingness that might not actually be there. And in this case, our work of disentangling our own Christian thoughts from the mythology we're reading has been made just infinitely more difficult for us by the fact that many of the people who recorded the Viking myths and recorded Viking history were Christian chroniclers. So we're not only dealing with our own bias, we're dealing with a complementary, like matching bias from the actual historical chroniclers. So, for example, some tellings of the Ragnarok, which is the Viking apocalypse, have it ending with two survivors, a man and a woman. Actually, it's really more framed like a woman and her husband um, are survive and live on to repopulate a new world, which sounds an awful lot like the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? And so we have a big problem, big fucking problem, which is that absolutely there's a very good chance the guy who first recorded that version of the Ragnarok was himself a Christian. So it's unclear, and you'd really like to know, wouldn't you, whether or not that particular detail comes from the fact that it's a Christian chronicler we're talking about, so he's maybe injecting some of his own ideas about the end of the world, or injecting his own sort of religious ideas in there, or is there genuinely this like very strong um, connection between the story of the Viking apocalypse and the story of the Christian, um, the beginning of the world. And we probably just will not ever get to know the answer to that question. Like the people who originally put the Vikings, the people who did most of the work of putting the Vikings in the historical record were, Christian. They believed in Jesus in a way that makes their beliefs completely disentangleable from the way that we view the Vikings, which is uh I don't know, like the fact that it is an unsolvable dilemma makes it just a thousand times more interesting. I don't know, like there's something sort of paradoxical in human nature here that I'm just now noticing as I'm bringing it up. Like, if this were a problem that like reliably would be like academics would solve in the next 50 years, it would be like, oh yeah, it's unfortunate that we don't know that, but we will know it eventually. But because it's like an intractable fucking mystery that is like never going to be solved, it suddenly is just 10,000 times more interesting. Like, how how different were the Vikings really? Like, how much of the stuff that we say about them is filled with like things that we sort of injected into their own worldview? Um, yeah. So Neil Price, another thing that he does that I really, really appreciate. So sorry, this is like quite a pivot to another Viking topic, is that he doesn't really like sugarcoat how like fucking evil like Viking society, not so, the Viking institution is. So the difference between uppercase V Viking, that means like the people group. Lowercase v Viking, that means like the profession. And the profession of being a Viking is that you go to other people's places, you fucking kill them, you take their stuff, and the ones that you don't kill, you enslave. Um, and I really think that because for some fucking reason people have decided that this is like a cool thing to do, that like culturally we're going to be like, that's awesome. I really think that the slavery part of things has really been de-emphasized. And in particular, like one aspect of the slavery that is like really, really like super prominent in the case of the like Viking slave trade is sexual slavery. Like a lot of the societies where these Vikings came from, for one reason or another, like Iceland, for example, had very high proportions of men. And you know, if you just do the math there, and also another aspect that is not in their favor in this regard is that it's been super duper resistant to like filtering its way into popular culture. But Vikings actually practiced polygamous marriage, so that's polygamy, not polyamory. So a man can have multiple wives, but not the other way around. Um, there's nothing like cool and free love about this institution. It's literally just a guy who has like multiple wives, and then all the same like expectations of like patriarchal monogamous marriage. You just have several of them. Um, and and hey, that sucks. And it sort of compounds your demographic problem with having too many men and not enough, too many bachelors and not enough bachelorettes, because some of the women end up married to the same guy. So you just compound the percentage of your population that are like fucking hormonal 20 something dudes who are like so horny, and you know, their only chance for getting a wife and like reproducing is if they go steal one. So I think it's actually like does a big disservice to history to whitewash, first of all, the slavery aspects of Vikings. Like that was like kind of the main thing. um Really, I mean, this is like a global slave trade we're talking about. Like the comparison should be that this is like a proto version of the like transatlantic trade. Um, but with like and even more. I mean, the transatlantic trade was also very rapey, of course, but with like part of the like core motivation being to like go around the world, travel widely, and do a whole bunch of rapes. It's like a rape adventure from the beginning. And so Neil Price and also I, as you can hear from the way I'm talking about this, are just like really, we're both really confused and really kind of disgusted that these people have been valorized and made into like I don't know, some sort of like pop culture, like something to be admired. Um, it's really just disgusting and actually kind of incomprehensible that someone would look at this. Um, and also, okay, another thing is it's not just the profession; it also is the society. Um, in the same way that the transatlantic trade negatively reflects the European and American nations and societies and peoples that participated in it, the Viking slave trade also negatively reflects on the Viking people. I mean, one way that I think about this is like they didn't get named after the most like disgusting, like violent, horrible thing that like job that people had because it was like an unimportant part of their society. Like, no, this was like a core part of their society. And I also just sort of retroactively, like when you understand that, think that it's really funny and maybe like a suitable punishment for them that their society is now named after the most horrible thing that they regularly did. It would be like if ancient archaeologists in the future were looking at like remains of like an American dig site, like the remains of like a mall in America or something, and they're like, ah, part of this the school shooter culture, I see. And they just like museums called Americans like the school shooters or something like that. Um, yeah, but somehow this sort of like not even historical revision. I mean, I guess there is a fair deal of historical revisionism going on here in terms of like how the Vikings are viewed. I believe that began in sort of the Enlightenment. Like people started looking back on these people, and part of this general like recontextualization of Christianity was to say like, okay, the Vikings have often been cast as like the prototypical pagans who are like against God. And now that we're sort of like reassessing the Christian legacy that we has been left to us as Europeans, we should also reassess these like prototypical pagan savages. But it's like, damn, bro, like just because you like don't believe in Jesus anymore doesn't mean that you have to think that the like rapist slave trader society is like good. Um, okay, anyway, so I was talking about the way that this negatively reflects on the society as a whole. Because to some extent, there was complicity at sort of at almost like all throughout the society in this Viking trading. And the other thing to keep in mind is that Vikings were not just, I mean, they didn't come from nowhere. It's not like Scandinavian people just woke up one day and they were like, I think we should go on a like loot and plunder adventure across the coastlines of Europe. No, Scandinavian people had been engaging in sea-based commerce for a really long time, and that is how they had a like pre-existing knowledge of where you could go, where the valuable shit was that you could just take. And Neil Price makes a really good point, which is that probably these you know, trading posts were pretty like scummy, like gross places to begin with. And you could really imagine someone who's used to this sort of seasonal, like you go here for the summer to do some trading. I want to emphasize that even at the trading stage, a lot of this stuff has to do with slavery. Like slavery is one of the like main commodities that people are trading. Slaves are one of the main commodities that people are trading here. Um, you could really imagine someone who participates in this seasonal, very like antagonistic type of thing, getting together with some of the boys and just like sort of calculating like, there's not really that many people who guard this like seasonal outpost thing here. Like, if we really wanted to, if we got even just like 20, 30 more guys, we could just show up next summer and just take it all and just fucking sail away. And so probably the pivot from trading to like opportunistically trading and sometimes raiding happened in that way. That's the situation that he describes. Um, yeah, I. The other thing is that he also talks about like the way that the goods that came from Viking raids ended up sort of dispersed all across society, which I think it's fair to say that that makes sort of everyone in those societies complicit. And he describes some situations that I find pretty evocative in terms of like the way that people might just sort of come to expect a certain level of luxury that is dependent on number one, stealing shit from people all over the world or all over Europe, and number two, that is based on like an underclass of slaves. um, and I'm not saying all of this stuff because we need to like cancel the Vikings or something. But I do just think that it's like important to take the cultural perceptions that we have of them and, I don't know, at least put them alongside who they actually were. Um, and that brings me to another like interesting thought I was having as I was reading this, which is that um, I guess generally I'm sort of accustomed to think of like Christian cultural imperialism as being not just bad, but like really, really fucking bad and maybe like kind of evil. But honestly, based on like reading some mythology and seeing how that connects to the way that the Vikings lived their lives, I'm super glad that this culture was obliterated by Christianity. Like Christians are not always like the nicest people, but I would at least prefer a cultural narrative that prioritizes like that like give us ascribe some sort of like dignity to victimhood and ascribe some sort of like value to the underclass that's being oppressed, and that like the people who want to oppress them nonetheless have to come up with some hypocritical reason that actually the CEOs are the real victims here, rather than a more like Viking style culture in which the powerful have the right to just do what they want, and that is like self-evident. um, as a part of preparing for this Sagas of the Icelanders game that I'm playing, I actually read some of the like actual sagas of the actual Icelanders, and I got through. I forget which one it's called, but it's like one of the most famous sagas. It's a little too long. I didn't actually finish it, so I guess I didn't get through it. But there's one episode that I think is really revealing in terms of like this difference in mentality, where there's this character Thorolf, right, who has through complicated like intermarriage has inherited a great fortune ahead of the children of the man who died. So he is inheriting this great fortune while the dead man's children are still alive and walking around. And the dead man's children confront Thorolf, and the narrative is very clear to emphasize the fact that Thorolf is a fair and just man ahead of this. And it's not being ironic, it's just blatantly, like straightforwardly saying Thorolf is a fair and just guy. And so these kids come to Thorolf and they're like, "Hey man, what's up here? Like, you're inheriting our inheritance. Like, we would like to have it, please." Um, and what Thorolf says is, "No, you can't have it. And the reason that you can't have it is that your mother was a slave. All of these, all of the legitimate sons and daughters are gone, whatever, and you guys are like the fake descendants whose mother was a slave." And so he disinherits these people, takes all their stuff, tells them to fuck off, leaves them in the cold. And the narrative is not even like dimly aware of the concept that this could be like something bad that he's doing. Like, this is not set up for Thorolf's eventual downfall. This is not indicating that he's done something wrong to these people and that they're going to be like important later in the narrative. It's not even like a contradiction of the idea that Thorolf is just and fair. The moral of the story is like, just like, don't be born to like a slave mother, idiot. Just like, don't be a slave. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that that is like a cultural worldview around what it means to be dispossessed, what it means to be a victim. That is just, fucking bad. And I'm glad that that worldview was replaced by something better. So take that, pagans. Um, there aren't many of them left, and the few that people that do call themselves pagans are still very influenced by like the Christian values and worldview. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Maybe I'll read like a cool book on modern neo paganism. But that's a topic for another time. Um, so so yeah, and the book Children of Ash and Elm also makes very clear that that type of attitude is like intermingled with and in some ways sort of comes from the cosmological worldview that they have, like the spiritual beliefs that they have. Um, yeah, so the Vikings, it turns out they were fucking bad. There are some things that are actually really nice about them. The last topic I want to talk about is gender roles, which I find really interesting. Maybe we can work in some like, discussion of magic in there. Um, but Oh, and one more thing that I want to say that I feel is really necessary is that the the comparison to the transatlantic trade is not just in terms of like the brutality and the like amount of wealth that's being generated, but also in the breadth of the trade networks here. Neil Price goes out of his way to point out that it wouldn't be that inconceivable for a Viking to like know about Chinese people. Like, we're talking about a huge trade network that involved goods and often people traveling large distances for profit. In other words, it's very similar to a sort of condensed version of the transatlantic trade, but only with a few dynamics removed. There's no, epidemic disease enabling colonization. Um, there are frontiers that open up like new resources and exchange. We're talking about Iceland here, but it seems like everybody says that Iceland was actually just straight up uninhabited before the Vikings started settling it. I guess that might not be true, but Neil Price seems to believe it, so I feel pretty comfortable in asserting that that there was a major difference there in that Iceland was actually uninhabited, whereas the Americas needed to be, needed to have its inhabitants removed before that could become, before it could become settleable land. Um, okay, so yeah, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that the transatlantic trade comparison is not just about the brutality and the slavery, but also about the extent of the trade. Like this is in some sense, it's like a like 11th century form of globalization. Like you have globe spanning trade networks that these people are participating in with some awareness that they are participating in a network that spans the globe. Um, so yeah, that's interesting. I don't fully know what to make of that, but it's just it runs a little bit counter to my like cultural view of Vikings, which is that they like were good at sailing, but they would basically just like find some poor fucking French monastery and be like, "Yeehaw, we're gonna kill everybody here and take all their shit." Whereas in fact, the Vikings were absolutely violent shitheads, but also cosmopolitan violent shitheads who would have a good chance of at least of having like heard about Islam and like understanding what it is and maybe even being able to explain to you its relationship to Christianity. Like these are people these are not people from a I mean they are people from a backwater, but these are people from a backwater who are plugged in to a like globe spanning network and who have an awareness of what that means and could I don't know talk to you about it if you were ever to encounter one perhaps after they had enslaved you. Um, anyway, so the other thing that I want to talk about is gender roles, which are the reason that I'm so interested in them is because they're a very big feature of the Sagas of the Icelanders tabletop role playing game. Another thing that makes it, like I said, probably one of the most interesting role playing games ever made is that it has this orientation towards gender roles as represented in the Icelandic sagas and in 11th century Icelandic culture. And well, the short version is that they're of course they're like no big surprises here. They're patriarchal gender roles, but it's a form of patriarchy that I think people are like not used to thinking about, where the gendered expectations for men like are also like a gender prison. It's just like a different type of gender prison that involves I don't know, more ability to like get on a boat and sail away somewhere else if you feel like it. Um, the way that the game represents this is that yes, men have all of the typical like liberty and power that you would associate with being in charge of women and having sort of an independent existence in a way that women don't. But they also are burdened by the dictates of personal honor, which sometimes necessitate that they do really fucking horrible things that you just like would not want to do as a person. Um, like to give a historical example, dueling, honor dueling, uh, is was like a big part of Icelandic culture during the time. And eventually, this sort of like nexus of cultural and economic factors sort of like imploded the economy, the like political economy of the country because you could essentially using honor obligations force someone to duel you. And so what these people would do, Iceland didn't exactly have a state at the time. You can think of it as more like a Wild West type situation. What people would do is they would get first of all they would get really good at fighting. Um, make it so that they're going to win just every duel that they fight, and then they would come into a community. They would completely fabricate claims on someone else's property, like just like, oh yeah, my dad used to live here, and actually you stole this stuff from him. And then they would challenge their victim to a duel, and of course win. And they would use this system, use this the I don't know scam that I've just described to basically like force men into honor duels where what's at stake is all of their property, and then they would use that to accumulate property. These guys were professional duelists, and they're a big part. Iceland was for like a few hundred years, like sort of. I know it's kind of a contradiction in terms, but like an anarchist republic, if that makes sense. There was no standing army. There wasn't really like a police force or anything like that, but there was still a code of laws that were collectively enforced. And there was a Supreme Court and a like council of basically governors. Um, it's a really weird system that sounds like it just wouldn't work, and it did eventually implode. But it also worked for like 100 years. Anyway, another time I'll read a book on like the history of Iceland or the Icelandic Republic because it's a really interesting history that I don't know that much about. But anyway, back to Vikings, um, of which Icelanders are one subset of Vikings. And God, I keep delaying the gender topic, but another thing that I think is important to understand is this the extent of the like reach of Viking people and cultural ideas, and like the sheer like number of people who like are sort of descended from Viking societies. Obviously, you have the ones that everybody knows about: the Scandinavians, Norway, Iceland, Greenland, Sweden. I think Finland might be a little more complicated, but let's throw Finland in there and the Baltic countries. Um, but also, plenty of the Slavic countries also have Icelandic origins. Kiev was basically a Viking trading post. Like, that's how it originated. Um, and Similarly, not only like many Russian settlements, but actually the concept of like Russia itself originates from Viking culture. So the Rus people, who are like the progenitors of both Ukraine and Russia, are basically like a Viking offshoot. They did something very similar to the Vikings. There's sort of like a cultural difference, but we're talking about like Americans and Canadians here, when we compare the Rus to the Vikings. Um, they like their political economy was very similar based on sort of like trading and raiding. It's just that the Rus were more sort of like geographically contained and in a different region. And once they started sort of like founding or like merging with or like getting involved with states, um, things really changed in terms of like who those people were, their identity, what they did. But the point is to emphasize that many countries in Europe, Eastern European countries as well as Northern European countries, not to mention, um, you know, our classic Western European countries like England and France, um, were heavily influenced by Viking culture. And in cases like Ukraine and Russia, people tend to argue that people sometimes argue that these are essentially like Viking countries, that they're like progenitors and like originators are Vikings who became Christians. Um, and Yeah, okay. Anyway, that with that out of the way, I think we can finally talk about gender. So gender the gender topic for Vikings has some pleasant surprises, but pleasant surprises, of course, within the context of a patriarchal society. My expectation of a slave society where the one of the primary motivations for enslaving foreigners is so that you can like rape them. Um, my expectation for that kind of society in terms of like how it views women would base and also like a polygamous society. I would expect that society to view women as essentially chattel, and indeed that is exactly how enslaved women were viewed. However, uh, women who were not enslaved, women who came from good Viking households, did actually have rights, and the rights were very weird. Once again, like the weirdness that we're seeing here comes from the fact that the Vikings were not like a Christian originated society. So they could be very backwards in some ways compared to Christians and very like progressive in other ways. And there was no contradiction because the overall like shape of the culture is just fundamentally different. Um, so for example, like sexual liberty. because there's no like expectation of like chastity before marriage. Vikings were Viking Vikings in general, and including Viking women, were expected to, be sexually adventurous in their youth. And there's even one record. It's not super clear to us if it's like a joke or if this is for real. But one there's one record of a man talking about how he found out that his wife was a virgin and was like kind of upset by that. Like, did nobody want her? Like, what's wrong with her? Which is a very like it boggles the mind. Like, you can't imagine someone thinking such a thing in a Christian context. That being said, once a woman was married, uh, her those sexual adventures were supposed to stop. Marriage was still basically an institution for men to control the sexuality of women. And I don't know about in other parts of the Viking world, but in Iceland, it was even like considered legal for a man to kill a man who had slept with his wife. It's like a killing offense. Um, Okay, the other area that seems like very progressive in comparison to neighboring Christian societies is divorce. Women could get divorced from their husbands, and they could do so for a wide range of reasons, including just I don't like him, I don't want to be married to him. Which is interesting. It gives women a sort of source of power, and it kind of makes me wonder. Neil Price doesn't really get into this so much, but it kind of makes me wonder how Vikings maintained a polygamous marriage society in which women were able to get divorced, because that seems kind of unstable or difficult or like complicated in some way. There's something to just be said. Like, there's some sort of explanation is necessary for how you can have both of those things, because polygamy in general is not so great for the women involved. It's not as horrible as some people would have you believe. It's not. It's not necessarily. There's not necessarily like a one-to-one relationship between polygamy and people like viewing women purely as objects, but it is definitely correlates with certain trends in society that are like not great for women's rights. Um, and so I'm just curious how those two things came together, and Neil Price doesn't really talk about them very much. Um, the other area is in sexual violence, where, of course, like the like I said, like Viking society was like a very, I don't know, sexual violence oriented society. But in terms of sexual violence that was committed against Viking women, um, that would be considered like a dishonor against her male relatives, and was like a very serious offense. Like, you could be executed for raping a Viking woman, which is, I don't know. It's just it's a pleasant surprise, is all. Um, so yeah, I don't really have a great like set of concluding remarks. Just like, what an interesting people. And I guess one thing that I can say to wrap things up is, I really sort of struggle sometimes to read history because it just doesn't fit in my head in the same way that other things do. But one thing that has really sort of helped me contextualize this is that the Vikings are in many ways the sort of bridge in European history between the Roman period of history and the more modern period of history. Because what happens is, in the early like prevalence of the Viking cultures, like the rise of the Viking cultures, you see these like seaborne like communities uh, gain power and like take prominence and like just basically like take the stage of like European history in the context of the chaos that was left behind by the collapse of the Roman Empire. And then near the end of the prevalence of Vikings on the world stage, you sort of see the emergence of what we would recognize not as like modern nation states, but as like late Middle Age Middle Ages nation states, like groups that we could recognize, like the Kievan Rus, or um, if you don't know about them, the Charlemangian Empire. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know French history. Um, but anyway, yeah, that really helped me. The recognizing that there's sort of a bridge between Roman and more modern histories really helped me to sort of like contextualize where they fit into the story of the world. So yeah, what an interesting and frankly fucking disgusting group of people. I loved reading this book. I think in the future I might read another one. I rate it three be blooded X's out of 5.